Hi, this is Mrs. Pullen for lesson 8.02 on vertical shifts of sine and cosine curves. And in this video, I'm going to go over exercises 3, 4, and 5, as well as a couple of the practice problems. So first, we want to graph this function y equals 4 sine of x minus 2. And the general form of a sine curve with a frequency of 1 is a sine of x plus d. A represents the amplitude, which is always a positive value. So in this case, it's positive 4, and so it remains 4. And the amplitude is the distance, the vertical distance the highest point is from the baseline, or the lowest point is from the baseline or the midline. The midline, or the vertical shift, is represented by d. So in this case, it's -2. And you can either shift the graph upwards, and so d would be positive, or you can shift the graph downwards, and d would be negative. So d can be a negative value. The midline is that horizontal line that represents the baseline or that shift. So the baseline is shifted, in this case, down 2, and we represent that by horizontal line. So I'm going to create a horizontal line, a nice thick line at -2. And it's really important to label. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to do is find the maximum and minimum value of the graph. So the maximum value of the graph is your amplitude plus the vertical shift. Remember, when I'm looking at the amplitude, I'm looking at the distance, in this case, 4 units above the baseline of -2. That's why it works like this in the formula. So it's 4 plus a -2 is 2. My midline, as I said before, is just my vertical shift. So it's that horizontal line, y equals -2. And my minimum value is below, in this case, it's 4 units below my midline of -2. So that's why we represent it as -a, because you're going below that line, plus d. So it's -4 plus a -2, which is a -6. Now, normally, sine is going to start on the midline. It's going to go to the maximum value, back to the baseline or midline, down to the minimum value, and back to the midline. In other words, if you look at a unit circle, it would be 0, that would be the x-axis, 1, 0, -1, 0. So that would be the normal pattern. But in this case, because my amplitude is not 1 anymore, and my vertical shift is -2, you're not using the pattern. Instead, that's why we have that mid-max, mid-min, mid pattern. So it's going to be -2, 2, -2, -6, and -2. And so we're going to graph this pattern, and I'll graph it in green. So it's -2, the midline. And actually, I forgot to label this. So 2, 4, 6, -2, -4, -6. So it's -2, 2, back to the midline, back to -6, and back to -2. And I'm going to make a nice smooth curve. Now we want to go backwards. So when we're going backwards, we're actually looking at that leftmost point. So do you see how we're going midline? So -2 down to -6, down to negative, back to -2, up to the maximum, back to -2. We're following that same pattern, right? So if we're here, that's this point here. So if we're going backwards, that's why we have that -6. Then you cross the midline, so -2, go back to the maximum value, and back to the midline. So I'm just looking at the curve in reverse. So you can either look at it from the curve, or if you're writing the pattern, just go backwards, go upwards from that -2, from that at 0 degrees, that -2. And of course, we're going to remember to label our graph. What is the range of a function? Well, the range of a function, and we're writing it in interval notation, goes from your minimum y, always the lower number, the minimum number is to the left, to the maximum y. And so in this case, it's going to be from -6 is our lowest value, and our highest value is +2. And so that's our range. Okay, we're now going to do y equals -2 cosine of x plus 3. And this has like a little modification here because we see that negative. And what that negative means is that you're going to reflect each of your points over the x-axis. Okay? So the general form of a cosine equation with a frequency of 1 is a cosine of x plus d. So A is the amplitude, and it's always a positive value. And that's why we take the absolute value of it and we get 2. The vertical shift is just moving the whole graph up or down, so it can be negative. You're not taking the absolute value of it. And in this case, it is positive because you're shifting the graph up 3. Your midline is actually this horizontal line, and you're going to write it as y equals 3. So it's whatever that d is. So let's graph that line. And I'd like to just make it a little thicker. And so I'm going to make y equals 3. I really should label the y-axis first. I apologize in advance. You should, so you don't forget. So 4, 5, 6. And then we're going to label this -3, -6. And our x-axis is already labeled. Okay. Our minimum value of the graph, or let me be consistent. My maximum value of the graph is the distance above the x-axis. So not above the x-axis, above the midline. So if my midline is at 3, then I'm going to go 2 units above because that's what my amplitude is. So in essence, you're just taking the amplitude and adding g to it. So it's 2 plus 3 or 5. Or midline value is just whatever the midline is. So it's going to be d or 3. And our minimum value, now you're going the distance below the midline. That's why it's -a. That's why you're negating it, plus d. So it's -2 plus 3 or 1. Okay, next. Now, normally cosine would be 1, 0, -1, 0, 1 if you're pulling the numbers off from the unit circle. But instead, so it would be max, mid, min, mid, max. But because you're reflecting the graph over the x-axis, okay? So in essence, what's happening, you're going -1, 0. When you reflect something over the x-axis, the y values change sign. So the 1 becomes a -1, and the -1 becomes a +1. So in essence, our pattern is now minimum, middle, maximum, middle, minimum. And that's because you're reflecting it over the x-axis. So I'm going to graph those points in green. Okay, again, we're starting at 0 degrees so we don't get confused. So it's -1. Oh, I forgot to write down the value, so ignore that. So the minimum value we said before was 1. The midline's 3. The maximum value is 5, 3, and 1. So let's graph that. So this is 1, 3, 5, 3, 1. And now we're making a nice smooth curve. And now we have to go to the other side. Remember, you're going backwards. So we're here. So we're starting out at 1. We're now going to the midline. So 3, going to the maximum value, going back to the midline, and going back to the minimum value. Make the nice smooth curve and label. Okay. Next. Example 5. They ask you to find the range of the function. And we actually did this before, but we're just going to do this again. It's really important to be able to pull information off. Oh, I think I forgot to do the range here. Hold on, let's go back a second. They want you to find the range of the function we just graphed. Remember, range is your minimum y value, always to the left, to the maximum y value. And we already calculated our minimum y value was that 1, and our maximum y value was 5. So by graphing the way we are, we can actually immediately find the minimum and range, the minimum and maximum value. So we're going to use that here on example number 5. We only want the range. So we need the minimum y. And the minimum y again is the amplitude plus the vertical shift. So it's going to be 7 plus 4. Wrong. That's the maximum value. The minimum is -a plus d. So in this case, it's -7 plus 4 or -3. The maximum y is positive the amplitude plus d. And so it's 7 plus 4 or 11. And in interval notation, our range would be -3 to 11 in closed brackets. Let's do B. Now, see, there's a negative in front. That means the function's flipped over the x-axis. A is just the absolute value of that -5, so it's 5. So and D is just the +2. So if I want to find the minimum y value, it's just a plus d. So you're negating that amplitude plus d because you're going below that line. That's why it's negative. And so it's going to be -5 plus 2 or -3. The maximum value is the positive of the amplitude plus d. So it's going to be 5 plus 2 or 7. And so our graph is going to be -3 to 7. Okay, 6 we're going to do tomorrow, and I just wanted to go over some students had a little bit confusion on number 6, so I wanted to go over it. Number 6 said, when graphed, the line y equals 14 would not intersect the graph for which of the following functions. Okay. So remember, y equals 14 is this horizontal line at y equals 15. So if it doesn't intersect, it has to be entirely below the function. So it has to be below the lowest value or it has to be above the highest value. So what we're going to do is find the maximum and minimum values for each of our functions. So for choice 1, my amplitude is 5 and my vertical shift is 9. So my minimum value is the negative of the amplitude, so it's -5 plus 9, or 4. Our maximum value is the amplitude, +5, plus 9, or 14. Well, if y equals 14, it's going to be tangent to the maximum value of that cosine function. So that's not your answer. Let's do number 2. Y equals -6 cosine of x plus 10. So here the amplitude is the absolute value of -6, or 6, and the vertical shift is 10. Our minimum value is going to be the negative of the amplitude, so -6 plus 10, or 4. Our maximum value is going to be +6 plus 10, or 16. Well, 14 is below that maximum value, so it's going to hit the cosine curve at least twice. So that's not our answer. Now let's do 3. We have y equals to 2 sine x plus 15. Well, the amplitude's 2. The vertical shift is 15. My minimum value is going to be the negative of the amplitude plus the vertical shift, which is 13. Our maximum value is going to be the amplitude plus the vertical shift, or 17. Well, 14 is right between 13 and 17, so that means that horizontal line is going to definitely intersect that sine curve. And now we're going to go through the last choice, which is the answer, but we should go through it anyhow so you can understand. Y equals 3 sine of x plus 20. The amplitude is 3, the vertical shift is 20. My minimum value is the negative of the amplitude, so -3 plus 20, which is 17. That's the lowest point in the graph. The maximum value is equal to amplitude plus 20, or 23. So if I had this function, and I'm not going to be drawing it properly, but if I had this function, all right, the lowest point on the graph in 4 is going to be 17, right? All right. But the midline of y equals 14 is below it. That means that since the midline is entirely below the lowest point of the graph, it's not going to intersect the graph. And that's why choice 4 is the answer. I hope that helped.